Good afternoon. My name is Mark Cole, and I was lucky enough to be asked to run a session on liberating leadership for the ODNE Carnival of Disruption, which took place on the 22nd of September. I wasn't able to make a recording of that event, so this is a substitute which kind of covers off some of the key thinking that underpinned that session. It doesn't obviously offer the feedback the participants generated, but it does give a sense of some of the issues we discussed and some of the techniques that were being advanced in terms of how we might look at leadership in a more critical way, in a way that actually allowed us, perhaps as OD practitioners, to think differently about the work we do, about the work of leadership, and how those two might connect. I'll start with some words about why liberating leadership is important to me. And I guess there are two origins here. The first was a very practical origin in terms of the work that I do. So I'd reached a kind of point where I was mindful of the fact that no matter what I was saying in terms of encouraging leaders to think differently about their work, and in particular to think systemically about their work, I was making little progress. And I took that to mean potentially, and almost certainly, that may reflect on my capacity to carry that message. So I had a careful think about the way in which I was trying to advance those ideas and the way in which I connected with people. But there was something else there for me which suggested that leadership and leaders were finding it difficult to even hear that message whenever it was expressed extremely clearly. So the message itself wasn't translating across into the practice of leadership. And as I say, with all communication, there's both the encoding and the decoding. And the encoding of the message is my responsibility, and the decoding is the responsibility of the recipient of that message. So I'd done some work around the encoding bit and thinking about how I was conveying that particular message. And then I started to think about the decoding and what might inhibit the decoding in a really authentic and meaningful way. At this juncture, I was talking with my colleague and friend, John Higgins, and off the back of a series of conversations that we were having about contemporary leadership and our experiences of working with leaders, and particularly this apparent barrier towards getting leaders to think somewhat differently, slightly more obliquely about their practice, we began to write a book. And the book will, in fact, be published by Routledge next year. And it takes a very, very critical look at leadership at its very foundational level, right the way through to its practice across business world and beyond. So that's the origins of it, a kind of concern around my practice, and then an investigation with John, a conversational inquiry about our experiences, our understanding of the world, and beginning to think more critically about leadership. Now, this session is about approaching leadership from a slightly different perspective in order to have the freshest thinking about our work in leadership. So I'm very keen that we take a particularly critical view of leadership. That's not to say it's a destructive view, because criticism is not destructive, or at least critique is not destructive. But we do have a responsibility, I suspect, as OD practitioners, to really engage with these notions about looking underneath the practices that surround us, to be clear about what is going on, why is it the way it is, and to perhaps cast up the vision of what is happening and allow people to think about it more critically themselves. So the start is we are looking at leadership in a very critical way, not in order to be, as I say, destructive, but to be creative in terms of our thinking and our practice and what we try to do in the realm of organizations. As a result, for this session, it comes in two phases. First, it's thinking about techniques that will allow us as practitioners to interrogate the thinking that goes on in and around leadership. So we're very mindful, I think, or certainly I am extremely mindful, that there are a large number of leadership constructs, and in fact, some research I picked up on just recently suggested that the real issue for leadership as a practice is that it adds more and more constructs to its body of practice without ever sloughing any off, without actually looking at them and saying, I'm not sure that this one is actually doing what it's meant to do, and I'm not sure this is properly evidenced, and I can't judge what this one is trying to achieve. So there's something extremely important about being able to attend to the ideas, to the texts, to the approaches, to the models that surround leadership, and to really get under the skin of it. And as OD practitioners, we actually need to make space and time for ourselves to apply particular ideas in terms of thinking differently about some of those things. That would be my view. So the first phase of this session would be to think about techniques that would allow us to really engage with quite a common sense and commonplace ideas about leadership, which are familiar to us, which are so familiar they feel embodied, and which we really need to take time to look at askance, as if we were seeing them for the first time. The second phase was more about some thinking about the leadership constraints that prevent people from thinking beyond the boundaries of where they currently are. And that clearly relates to the materials that surround them. So if we assume that there's a body of knowledge around the practice of leadership, which decides what's acceptable and what is not in terms of people's thinking about what they do, then we have to accept that within those texts and ideas and models, there will be constraints, and we need to understand what those constraints are. And what I will do in this session is to cast up some of the constraints that in our writing, John Higgins and I have tried to explore and to articulate. That it's not an exhaustive list. I can't guarantee it's a list that everyone will agree with, but certainly from our perspective as the writers, this will be the list of things that we think really give shape to the space in which leaders can think, and that's critical for us. So two phases, techniques and means by which we might really get under the skin of the thinking about leadership that prevails across society, and secondly, a deeper look at the constraints that stop leaders from thinking differently about what it is they do. And what John very often says in terms of this particular piece of work is that what we're trying to get to are the headwaters of leadership thinking, whereas for a lot of the time, as OD practitioners, as people carrying the title of leader, we spend most of our time in the shallows, where there is no depth and no opportunity to dive down, and we're aware that somewhere further upstream, the real work is being done about determining what the flow actually looks like in which we try and practice. So we want to get to the headwaters because our view, fundamental view, is that leaders rarely attend to what constructs their thinking, and they really take that at a critical perspective and think about it differently. So that is my intention for this session, is to explore these things and hopefully give people something to take away in terms of how they might think afresh about it. So what I'm going to do now is just share some slides with you and talk through them to try and give shape to some of the ideas that are at work in this space. Right. So, as I've been saying, this is a session about liberating leadership, which is both liberating leadership as a body of thinking, but liberating leaders to work differently. And by leader, of course, I'm using the term as an active noun, a noun that takes on board the fact that you are a leader when you lead, and that doesn't really rely on people's position or power. And we are attending to the headwaters of management and leadership thinking, which are so often commonsensical and commonplace and rarely put under the microscope and carefully explored. During the course of the session on the 22nd of September, we did use menti.com, which allowed people to feedback on some of their experiences. And I would recommend it as a method because it does allow for good capture in that regard. So the first point today is to think about text. And the reason I'm taking us there is that around leadership, there are a huge number of texts that come from a variety of settings. And I am using the text in an extraordinarily wide sense, not just to mean the written word, but posters, graphics, ideas expressed as diagrams, written stuff, strategies, white papers, thought leadership, all the noise that surrounds leadership, all the written material or the produced material can be seen to be textual. And the idea here is for us as OD practitioners to really engage with this idea of the text, to really get into dialogue with the materials that sit around leadership, and to make an assessment of the extent to which, when we get under the skin of some of that material, whether it does resonate with us or whether we think it's carrying a different purpose. So is it saying a fundamental truth, which will be very rare for a human artifact, or is it saying a partial truth, or is it saying an ideological truth, all of which we need to contest? And my view is that quite a lot of the material around leadership inadvertently creates a space that denies certain ideas and privileges others. And we'll have a look about how that might work in practice in just a moment. So we're going to be looking at books, and the beauty of this little meme lifted from the internet is that each of the titles of the books actually link together to make one long story. So the English patient had caught it on the beach. I should have stayed home, she said. Now she was in quarantine. And it goes on all the way to the two shelves. And that reminds us that in actual fact, we very often see a big picture, but in seeing the big picture, we rarely see the detail. And actually, in business thinking, and particularly amongst leaders, we're very often sent to look at the big picture. So can we look at the big picture is one of the phrases that gets kicked around boardrooms a fair bit, not just in fictional settings. And my view is that as OD practitioners, if we genuinely want to look at this stuff in a way that is different, if we genuinely want to help leaders to think differently about what they do, if we genuinely want to help them to get to a place where they're behaving differently, which may be beneficial to them, their organizations, and the people who work there, then we need to get them down to a level of detail. So we start to deconstruct the big picture and see what are the various components of that structure. And so, in essence, the top left corner of this picture shows houses, very apparent houses. And as it slides away, we're looking at various elements of it. So we see walls and roofs. And it reminds us that the house in the top left is constituted of various elements that perhaps we don't attend to when we see the house in and of itself. So that's where I think it will be. And that's the simplest way of thinking about it. So reading a text is like looking at the house. We should, as OD practitioners, feel ourselves entitled and feel equipped to start to break apart that writing, take apart that text, and think about what it is doing, why it is doing it, and how it is doing it. And so it's unusual. I know several people in the session on the 22nd ran aground at this point, and I probably hadn't thought carefully enough about how to introduce this notion. But of course, people will be familiar with the whole idea from French philosophy about deconstruction. Now, this derives from post-structuralist thinking, and particularly from Jacques Derrida, who's shown in outline in the background of this slide. It's not an easy topic, it's not an easy read, and what I've tried to do is to lift out 8 little components that for us as OD practitioners in a practical setting could apply to textual work, not as a system, so not saying, start at number 1 and finish at 8 and then you'll have deconstructed it, but to literally say around this circle are things that you can do differently when reading a piece of text. So instead of just reading it and taking it at face value, it is a bit about the traditional notion of can we read between the lines, and I think that's helpful. And what Derrida did was to take the whole notion of reading between the lines to the nth degree. And so it literally was, in fact, his argument was that the text deconstructs itself just because of its interrelations. So the presence of the word the at the start of a sentence gives a clear indication of potential coming up at the rest of the sentence, the presence of a verb, what it would sound like, what the noun would be. So he's saying that the text is constantly talking to itself. Now that's a rather opaque philosophical notion, but let me just talk through these 8 points. The starting point for us as OD practitioners, and I think this is a really useful application just in and of itself, when we see a text or when we stumble across an idea or when a new model appears, it very often resonates with things we have seen, things we have done, and very often with beliefs we already hold. So an opening gambit is to rethink the text as an entirely alien object. So it's not what it appears. It is something different to that which it appears. So when we think about a sci-fi film like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, there human beings are absorbed by pods, and then pods create a complete replica of the human being. And so we should be looking, and characters do in the film, look at each human being as if potentially they are not as they appear. That they look like something familiar to them, they look like their father or mother, they look like their friend or husband or wife. But in actual fact, there's something different, there's something completely alien. And so our starting point is to rethink the text as an alien object. And there's another way of talking about the word alien in this context, which is, imagine that an alien came from outer space and you presented them with a piece of text. So, for example, a piece of thought leadership about leadership, a model of leadership, the notion of compassionate leadership, for example. What would the alien make of it as they looked at it? It's so familiar to us because it's part of our vernacular. But what would someone completely separate to the cultural milieu that has produced this artifact, what would their view of it be? So rethinking the text as an alien object is both seeing it as something alien in itself, but also applying the eyes of an alien to it as if it's something that you've seen for the first time, and the very nature of it and its complexity is something completely fresh to you. So that leads us on to the second point, which is to not take the text at face value. Our reading of much, particularly non-fictional work, leads us to accept what is being said as a face value thing. The text is delivering this message. But that's a faulty view, because the text doesn't just have content, it is delivery as well. And the delivery piece is a bit where we're also deriving meaning. So do not accept what the text is saying it is doing. So if the text is saying, here we are presenting to you a fantastically new leadership concept, which is the idea of servant leadership, for example. Don't accept that that is what the text will necessarily do just because it's saying that it will. A lot of our understanding of literature and other pieces of writing tends to put the author in a privileged position. The author is the person who created this piece of writing, and so therefore their take on the writing is such that they have the authority in this picture. The post-structuralist argument is actually, once the author has written this and the text is released, then it belongs to anyone. And that by our reading the text, we are in essence rewriting it in our head. And there's something here about the Kurosawa film Rashomon, about one particular instance being seen in 4 or 5 different ways. Each way is authentic to the individual, but will be different. So the scene of a bandit attacking a couple going through a forest is seen through 4 or 5 perspectives. Each perspective is different, and yet the instance in time is exactly the same. We then move into the space where we should be looking to expose cultural biases. So what is being said here? What things are being smuggled in terms of expectations of how the culture might be in an organization, in a society, or whatever. And that helps us also to consider the language in use. So what language is being used, and alongside that, what cultural binaries are there, and what positions are being denied by the presence of a dominant position. So if in a piece of writing I assert that Charismatic leadership has had its day, and we're now committed to transformational leadership. I'm in essence denying any presence for charismatic leadership. I'm reducing it to a discourse that is unacceptable within the terms of my writing. And in doing that, why am I doing it? And to what extent is that voice then being denied? And is it a voice that we should hear? So these are important things. And the cultural binaries will be issues around male, female, black, white, sorts of things that will cross-hatch a piece of text and will carry all sorts of significant messages. So at its clumsiest, if a text constantly refers to leaders as in terms of masculine pronouns, it is carrying a huge message, as we recognize, in terms of how it thinks about the world, but more importantly, not how the text thinks about the world, but how the world will be shaped by the text, because people will be reading it and rewriting it through their reading. We're looking for the tricky bits in the text around inconsistencies and paradox, and importantly, contradiction. Is the text running against itself in different places? Is it saying one thing and advancing another? And those are important in terms of getting a proper handle on it. And then we're looking at tensions that might exist between the spirit and the letter of the text. So the letter of the text is saying a particular thing, the spirit of it seems to be saying another. Now, all 8 of these are just ways and means of casting a different lens onto something that we might come across. And I would not suggest that OD practitioners lift this as a model and try to apply it stage by stage, because that way madness lies. But this sequence of 8 is a means of just saying to us that we need to find new ways of looking at things that are ordinarily extremely familiar to us, but which might be hugely influential and might be unhelpfully influential in a number of ways. So that's Derrida and deconstruction, and I don't expect people to be able to just lift this stuff off and take it away, but it does help us to start to frame the way in which we might want to engage with text. Now, I have, just to talk about text, this slide in itself is, of course, a text. I have made a judgment as the author, although once I've authored it, I again go into the background. I've made a judgment about how to convey this content. How have I decanted this content out? Why do I think 1 to 8 is important? Why have I done certain things? So this text is open to us looking critically. And that allows us to ask questions like, what view would you as a reader or a viewer of this text take? What's your reaction to it? Why are there certain things in there? So the picture of Derrida, what message does that convey? Numbered boxes, how does that structure thinking? What might it convey as a message about the way in which we should think about things, when actually there might be altogether different ways of thinking about things, which goes to that stuff about a dominant discourse and discourses and ideas that are not dominant, and that by my process I may have sought to smother or inadvertently smothered. What is being conveyed out with just the text, the basic information, what's being conveyed through the constellation of all these elements? And what does the format say? So it's a grayed out slide, the picture is in kind of watermark, I've chosen post-it note symbols. What does that format say to you? Is it friendly? Is it hostile? What does it convey about the complexity of what's being communicated? What's going on in that, and how is the language shaping the text? So even having written that, I now look at it and think, some of that language is slightly oblique, and I could have worked differently. And I try to find things that would have been different ways of saying those things. And it reminds me that the writing bit often comes very easily to me, but the editing is always a problem for me. And finally, what is closed off through this textual presence? So in terms of this slide and this presentation, if this is the argument I'm promoting, what arguments are not being heard in this space? If we're just unidirectionally focused on the idea of deconstruction, of critically engaging with text around leadership, then what does that do in terms of other approaches, other ideas, other perspectives, and so on? And deconstruction is an endless process. It goes on and on and on. It constantly refreshes itself and reintegrates itself. So it's worth holding on to that as a constant activity. And it is just about asking questions of ourselves as we engage with text. Now, at this point, the group went into breakout and had some conversations, deconstructed conversations around the texts that people had been asked to bring to the session. And I did advise, and I say again, in terms of practitioners who might be listening to this, don't necessarily follow a particular format, even the format that I've promoted, but allow the text to unravel under your scrutiny and follow your creative reading and rewriting of the text wherever it might lead you. What you're looking for is not just what the text facilitates, what it creates and allows, but what by its presence it actually hinders and stops. And so that's quite important when we come on to think about what constrains leadership thinking, because it will be my argument that there are things that do so. So let me have a bit of a conversation about some of the work that John Higgins and I have been doing so far in terms of thinking about what constrains leadership thinking. These lists, as I say, are not exhaustive, and they certainly may not resonate with everyone. They are lists that John and I have felt really do give shape to the way in which we've tried to work and which have hindered the way in which we wanted to work, particularly in the field of leadership. Now, my starting point here is off the back of some work I did with colleagues, Liberating, Erin Beggett, and Sharon Jacob. And we were doing some work for a CIPD student conference in London last year. And one of the elements was to look at what I felt were paradoxes that came out of organizational life. And the paradoxes are important because it gives a sense of the way in which organizations don't connect and set in the way in which we think. They're not as cohesive as we think. They are very often in tension, and that tension generates with itself certain constraints in terms of what people can and cannot do. So there are 5 of these, and the first is that in organizational life we see a lot of discussion about health and well-being for the workforce, and many instances of organizations doing really good work in terms of supporting their people and trying to help them be their best in the workplace. And yet, alongside that, many working environments at best are pressured and at worst might be said to be quite hostile. In fact, work that I did previously with Steve Hearson through ODNE had a look at particularly the NHS as a hostile working environment, and much of the material that generated was a pretty gloomy picture of what it was really like to work in the health service, where there is a culture of command and control, quite a strong sense of busyness and expectation of busyness, very limited capacity for innovation and change. I'm talking kind of pre-COVID picture here, although the post-COVID picture is slightly more nuanced and interesting in that respect. So the first paradox is a lot of discussion around well-being, a lot of activity around well-being, and yet a culture and a climate in organizational life that works against well-being. And so those two things seem to be in quite close tension. The second element is around leadership. So certainly in many organizations, there's talk about inclusive and compassionate leadership, which tends to run contrary to quite high levels of heroic control that you still see as a leadership practice. One of the observations I very often make about leadership is there are, as I said at the start, myriad leadership constructs growing like topsy on a day-to-day basis, more and more being added moment by moment. But fundamentally, if you sit down with the daily newspaper and run from the front page through news, through politics, through business, and right the way through to the sports pages, the model of leadership that we see is extremely traditional, notwithstanding what we as OD practitioners might say about the best ways in which leaders should lead. The model remains heroic, individualized, charismatic, decisive, directive, all the things that don't sit terribly comfortably with slightly more modern concepts of leadership. So in actual fact, we know it's really a distance between, values in theory and values in action. And in leadership, there are lots and lots of values in theory around situational leadership, transformational leadership, all the ones we know about. But in practice, many leaders in the field, both in the private and public sector, are still leading on a very traditional model. So that's another paradox, I think, that sits at the heart of organizational life. Diversity of voice contra enforced homogeneity is one that pivots around the whole issue of corporate values. Organizations talk a lot about diversity of voice, the importance of getting a mixture of voices in the room to make sure that you can hear different opinions, and critically that you might be then to innovate and be creative in terms of driving your business forward. The diversity of voice is vitally important to hearing different perspectives, different takes, different understandings of the world. And yet, alongside that, is a sense in which by creating corporate values and requiring or having an expectation that people should tightly align to those values, you are in effect creating an enforced homogeneity. You are saying yes, 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 we'd like a diversity of voice, but actually we want pretty much everyone in this model. And so you kind of deny the notion of, for example, tempered radicals, which obviously appears in the literature, because you're saying you're going to be so tightly embraced by the values, you're probably not going to have much space in which to be radical. Now, I know tempered radicals as a notion are those people who agree with the organization but want to make it better. But I do think sometimes the values piece is quite tightly constraining and does prevent people from talking more authentically. Speaking of authenticity, there is this tension between expectations that leaders should turn up as their authentic self, and yet they are part of an overall superstructure that is designed to deliver in particular ways. And certainly in the private sector, there is that issue about how does one manage in a situation where, broadly speaking, you're meeting the expectations of shareholders when you're trying to be authentic in the space and working with your workforce in a different way. That's the fourth. And the last one is pretty much around the issue of introversion and extroversion. So there is a lot to be said, and it relates to diversity of voice, about organizations insisting that all should be heard, that no voice go unheard. And yet a lot of our practices in organizational life, and I'm thinking particularly about the way in which we continue to have meetings, even in the context of platforms like this, privileges extroversion. So the meeting, in a traditional sense, requires people to sit around and talk out loud. And there's little room there for finding ways in which other voices might be heard, introverted voices. And so that's another paradox that's worth acknowledging. Now, all of those clearly inhibit leaders from doing things in a different way. So a leader might feel that by attending to the well-being issues, by dealing with that, by having that as a dominant discourse, then there's no necessity to attend to the cultural issues of busyness and how people feel in the workplace. Similarly, if you can give lip service to models of leadership, but still lead in a way which people seem to want and respect, then you are inhibiting yourself in terms of actually genuinely embracing fresh models. So if the cultural position is still that it's a traditional leadership that we're following, then that constrains people from being different in the space. How can you be a non-traditional leader when the image of traditional leadership suffuses every cultural element of our lives? Enforced homogeneity probably speaks to stuff around the need to have a sense of control. So many leaders continue to feel that to be a leader is about taking on data, making a decision, and making it happen. But in a complex world, we know that that linearity is, broadly speaking, somewhat illusory. And that, again, can constrain the thinking for people. Superstructural position stops people from thinking as a human being. So one of the interesting exercises I've tried to think through over the past few months is to talk to people about the way in which they experienced the crisis, the COVID-19 crisis, as a human being, as a human subject, and then how did they experience it from the perspective of their professional position. And is there overlap there? Do the two sit comfortably together? And are there differences there? And if there are differences between your fundamental human reaction to the crisis we're running through and your professional perspective on that, then what's at play there for you in terms of your work and your activity? And then just about giving voice, we are still looking at leaders as people that potentially make the most noise. We still talk about meetings being built around the awaiting of the hippo. So awaiting for the highest paid person's opinion, because that's where the meeting will eventually end once that opinion is expressed and then the decision will be made. And so if we're still accepting that extroversion, noisiness, speaking in every opportunity is the right way of doing it, then it will structure the way in which leaders think about their leadership. So the paradoxes offer us that level of constraint. The slightly tighter constraints that John and I have been investigating are these 6. And these are actually, we take them to be management myths. So they need to be critically interrogated in and of themselves. And it's not just within management, it's across the field. So the first position that I think is open to contestation is this notion that all is fixable. So we tend to carry that around in our lives. It tends to leach into the kind of medical position. So we're seeing some of that in terms of COVID-19. People's expectation, well, surely medicine should be able to get this sorted and fixed. Surely the vaccine should arrive quickly. And that translates into things like, if you're a leader, then the expectation of you is that you fix things. And that means that everything is fixable. That links to something around perfection as the only state worth pursuing. So no matter what elegant solution you might generate to particular challenges faced in an organizing context, if it's not perfection, which of course is wholly illusory, then it's not worth having. You'll always be looking for the next thing, because it's not quite perfect. Not good enough will always be the real issue, and that means you're always chasing your tail looking for perfection. Linked to that, there is the argument that there is a right way of doing things. If perfection is the only state worth pursuing, then surely there is a right way of doing things. And this goes back to this issue about where we need, as OD practitioners, to really get under the skin of the thought leadership that surrounds the area of our work. Because a lot of people in that space, from professional service companies through higher education institutions, business schools in particular, individual gurus, people working as sole traders, they're all taking a view that there is potentially a right way of doing things and that they have the right way of doing things. And that myth is majorly problematic because it denies leaders the opportunity to think creatively for themselves and to accept there might be a panoply of ways of doing things, and it's really working through those different scenarios to see which fits best. It also creates the illusion that things can be fixed, because if there's a right way of doing it, then the destination will be something is fixed by your perfection. The final 3 are fairly self-evident. The 4th is that metrics reflect an objective truth. There is a significant, to John and I's thinking, a significant disconnect between the simulacrum of reality that senior leaders engage with in terms of rag-rated project plans, documentation that goes to board meetings, updates and reports, strategies, policies, all the material that floats around, the measurability of life, and the fact that life goes on separate to that measurability and maybe somewhat different to it. That's a really strong issue around metrics and objectivity and truth. So metrics in organizational settings make truth claims which may or may not be grounded in reality at all. And there are lots of corporate examples, and the Ford Motor Company is one of them, where a lot of the metrics indicated the corporation was doing extraordinarily well. And an incoming CEO was reassured at first sight by the materials that was coming through, until he then recognized that each batch of data he was receiving, whilst glossed to be positive, seemed to contradict material being sent to other audiences and seemed to run counter to some of the stuff he was receiving from other corporate elements. So there's a real issue around the myth that if I get enough data, then I will know the truth. Values bind the organization relates back to the paradox around values and homogeneity. The argument here is that actually values do very little around the whole workforce, and that broadly speaking, the work they do, the heavy lifting they do in corporate setting, is to bind together top leaders, particularly top leaders from diverse functions. So if you look at an executive team in terms of an HR function, a finance function, the argument John and I promote is that organizational values allow those various functions to cohere in order to work collectively to serve the purpose of the organization. And part of that's the sheer distance from the front line that many of those senior leaders will be at. But the values are important for them, but they don't necessarily do anything across the organization. And yet, it is assumed, there is a myth that says by those values we connect everybody, and they have a sense of corporate direction. And the final myth is this idea that we're all in it together, we share a common purpose. And in a complex capitalist society, that is patently not true. And it could be argued that the very term leader and follower helps to sustain that myth. We used to talk about, and this goes to the work of Mark Learmonth, who teaches up at Durham. We used to talk about managers and workers, and that binary opposition suggested precisely that, a tension potentially between the two perspectives, a sense in which they were not shared agendas, or if the agenda was shared, then it was an overlap, and there were elements of each agenda that was separate to that unity. When we talk about leadership and followers, there is a presupposition that there is a common purpose. So a leader will think about that as a way of taking the organization forward, but it's mythical in many ways. So I've shared with you the paradoxes and the myths that underpin the work that John Higgins and I have been doing, which for us are the constraints that stop leaders thinking creatively about their work. And much of this derives from the textual elements that surround leadership. So a cursory glance at any of the thought leadership coming from a professional services company will reinforce this. A quick look at the Harvard Business Review, for example, will give you a strong sense that each article is telling you, actually, this is what real life is about, and it's fixable. And if an executive can just run through our checklist or just do these 5 steps, then the world will snap into place in the way they expect. And that's not helpful for leaders because it stops them from working in a way that is genuine for them, and a way which is open for others, and in a way which allows organizations to genuinely develop. And so this cartoon, and apologies for the spelling error at the bottom of this, which I simply plundered from the internet, but really thought it underscored my point, particularly in terms of the myths, is that we are setting up leaders very often and saying to them, go and find out how to lead, go and find out leadership for beginners. But in reality, they may already be doing precisely what they need to be doing. And we are just sending them off down various rabbit holes when we talk about things like leadership development. I'm very conscious, having worked with him just recently, that Steve Hearson is doing some very important theoretical work in this regard, thinking about leadership development, other elements of business through the prism of no silver bullets. And so I would commend his work because I think he's making really interesting observations about some of this stuff. Now that kind of takes us to a point where we might want to think out of the box. So as OD practitioners, if we have interrogated all the various elements of the text that surround leaders and leadership and our practice, then we're in a position, I think, to start thinking about what would stop leaders with whom we work from thinking differently about the work they do, and then how could we work alongside them to help them to critically engage with the ideas that surround their practice, and to help them then to step forward and to work in different ways which might be beneficial in an organizational setting. And so it is our responsibility, in my view, to really get on top of this notion and to start to talk about leaders about what it is that's constraining their thinking. Because I think that's the starting place for a really proper engagement with leadership. We have tended to have a model of leadership where we presume there is a person who moves into a leadership position and who we then induct into it by the introduction of various capabilities, knowledges, skills. I think that's a slightly artificial one, because the position we probably need to take as ODE practitioners is to help leaders to really engage critically with what's going on around them, so that they don't just take at face value the ideas and the practices that are there, and they don't just rush for the quick solution or the off-the-shelf solution, and really take time to genuinely earn the term leader by thinking through for themselves a nuanced way of approaching the problems that they face. So this would be my view, that we as OD practitioners, in terms of liberating leadership, have to liberate ourselves to begin with by really getting in contact with the materials that surround our practice and really taking them apart, and then working with leaders to help them think creatively about precisely that, and what might be a different, a more oblique way of approaching their challenges, and a way that simply does not reproduce what they've already done, but helps them to think differently about it. That's a bit of a canter through the two phases that I said we would cover today. The first phase, as I said, was thinking about the practice of deconstruction, but really is about applying a critical eye to the materials that surround our practice, so that we think differently about them and help others to think differently about them. And then the second phase has been to talk about this element of constraint and what it is that stops leaders from being leaders in many ways. I've just finished a book by someone called Nathan Harter, who is a very slender volume called Foucault on Leadership. And Harter is a writer on leadership practice in a university in the United States, and he's analysing two lecture series that Foucault delivered towards the end of his life. His observation is quite simply that we have spent our time thinking about leadership development with a capital L and a capital D, and about how we prepare someone to be a leader. And the argument that seems to be coming out of some of the observations that Foucault makes is that if we support people to take care of themselves, to engage with the notions of power around them, to embrace the idea of speaking truth to power, to embrace the very notion that others might speak truth to you, and that you need to be equipped to listen to it and to act differently on it. Those are not leadership development qualities. Those are qualities around the care of self that are vital to human agents in a practical setting. And if we support people to do those sort of things, if we encourage them to be better able to look at the world in which they're in, better able to attend to their needs and their development, better able to look at the notion of power and truth and to speak out when they need to, then we're equipping them to be better human beings, but also that they might then be well equipped to step into leadership positions. So instead of thinking the leadership position as the starting point, where we then build development alongside it and in front of it, we should think about development as a human attribute, so that a human being is best equipped to take on leadership as and when it presents itself, which in turn kind of fragments the whole notion of leadership as a status, leadership as an epistemology, rather than leadership as a being, as an ontology, as a way of being in a particular setting. And so that, for me, is the challenge for OD practitioners, that if we want to see a liberated leadership, and if we want a leadership that genuinely liberates, then we need to be alongside people to help in their development by literally encouraging them to look differently at their world, and to think about what is it that is inhibiting me from thinking differently and behaving differently, and what would happen if I did. And for us to do that well, we have to go through that process ourselves. Excuse me. Just the final slide, which offers, first of all, the website for Radical OD, where I write blog posts around what I see as challenges and issues in organizational philosophy. And I hope people would go there and engage in a debate about this. There is an email below, and I'm always open to hear from people and for these kind of conversations to continue, particularly insofar as this is just a recording of me talking, whereas I would prefer if it was conversational. The third one is the Twitter account for Radical OD, and then finally I have set up a mighty network for people interested in Radical OD, and obviously if people want to join that, there is a link there, or alternatively contact me and I will add you to that network. I hope that's been useful. I hope it's been insightful. I hope I've expressed what I was hoping to express clearly, and I'm sorry if that hasn't happened. I'm happy to have follow-up conversations if there are things that are outstanding for you or things that you want to take issue with. But ultimately, I do believe for OD as a practice, we need to be engaged in conversations like this to ensure that we are best able to support the people that in principle we're working with, which are people in the workplace, in organizational settings, and we need to be creating new opportunities for those people in order that they can work differently. So I thank you for bearing with me and for listening to this presentation, and I hope people will take time to make contact as and when they can. Would really welcome the opportunity to extend the conversation, continue the conversation, and engage with the ideas that others might have in this regard. Thank you once again.